Hi everyone. I'm just checking with our tech support that everything is going all right. James. Excellent. So thank you everyone for joining us today for the webinar for the Australian Society of Archivists. I appreciate you connecting in and joining me for this topic, talking about Indigenous archives and record keeping. And thanks to the Australian Society of Archivists for setting up all the technology for us today. Okay. So I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I am based, here in Sydney, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and acknowledge those communities that make up the greater area of Sydney, the Dharawal and Darug peoples. I also want to acknowledge at the outset the richness and diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, cultures and countries, and I also extend this acknowledgement to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have joined the webinar today. So the purpose of the webinar is to introduce you to the topic of Indigenous archives and record keeping, and to provide you with some information on the release of a new learning module that has been produced by the ASA on this topic. The main aim of the seminar is to get you thinking about the ways that you can increase support for Indigenous Australian people in the area of archives and records. So the format is the session is that I'm going to present information to you for the next 25 minutes or so, and then leave time for question and answers. We've gotten to know GoToMeeting this morning, and I can see there's a question box that you can write into as part of the webinar and ask questions. And I'll use this to frame the question and answer section later on. So before we get into the topic today, I want to take a few moments for us to reflect on Australia's long history. We live in an amazing country, and one where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have lived and thrived for thousands of years. As the Redfern mural said, 40,000 years is a long, long time. 40,000 years still on my mind. As we discuss this topic today, I want to acknowledge that we live on a land that has been home to thousands of generations of Indigenous men and women, a land that has been created, cared for and maintained with respect by many diverse Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and language groups. I'd also like to take a moment to reflect on the fact that yesterday was Sorry Day, and to acknowledge and pay respects to those people who have been impacted by Australia's colonial project, and importantly, the survivors of the stolen generations. In the context of Sorry Day, I also want to draw on the words expressed by Indigenous X founder Luke Pearson, who yesterday reminded us that the first Sorry Day was held in 1998 on the anniversary of the Bringing Them Home report being tabled in Parliament. Luke reminded us that Sorry Day isn't just a day of remembrance, it's a call to action to implement the 54 recommendations from the report. Saying sorry wasn't the only recommendation. And it's in that context that I want to frame my introducing of the module today and the topic of Indigenous archives and record keeping. We have a great profession, but we still have a lot of important work to do to ensure that people can access, manage and be connected to their cultural heritage materials in meaningful and culturally safe ways. It's been 23 years since the Bring Them Home report, which I'll discuss more in detail today, and we still have much unfinished business to do as a sector. So it's important that I introduce myself as well today and place myself in the context of this presentation. My name is Kirsten Thorpe. My family are Warramai people from Port Stephens in New South Wales. My family line is through the Bergmans, Newlands, Feeneys and Mantons. I grew up on Wanneroo country in the Hunter Valley, and I've called Sydney home for the past 20 years. I'm a member of the Jumbunna Research team at the University of Technology, Sydney, under the leadership of Distinguished Professor Larissa Brent, where I lead a small team whose focus is on Indigenous archives and digital stewardship. I'm also a PhD candidate at Monash University, where I'm undertaking doctoral studies on the question of Indigenous cultural safety and self-determination in Australian libraries and archives. And I very much want to acknowledge my supervisors to this work, Professor Suma Kemish, Dr. Alex Byrne and Dr. Shannon Forkhead, who have all made incredible contributions to this sector. So I came to the archives field in the late 1990s as part of an Indigenous employment program, which recognised the lack of Indigenous people that worked in this sector. Since that time, I've been an active member of the ASA and the Indigenous Special Interest Group, progressing conversations and support about need in this area. I, along with Loris Williams in Queensland, was one of the first Aboriginal people to gain professional membership to the ASA in the early 2000s after completing postgraduate studies in archives and records. I've had an opportunity over the past 20 years to be involved in developing protocols, policies and services for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a range of library and archive settings. And my interests very much relate to Indigenous self-determination in libraries and archives. And I guess particularly my work has had a focus on projects that have involved the return of historic collections to communities. I'm an advocate for the transformation of practice to centre Indigenous priorities and voice in regards to the management of data, records and collections. And one of my key interests is in relation to the support for community archives and questions of how resources can be radically realigned so that communities keep and manage their collections on country. I've had roles across government archives. I've worked at the New South Wales State Archives with colonial collections and records of the former Aborigines Welfare and Protection Board, and contributed to research undertaken in relation to stolen wages in New South Wales under the New South Wales Aboriginal Trust Fund scheme. I contributed to the ATCEDA project at UTS, looking at the return of research data to communities, and previously helped to establish the Indigenous branch at the State Library of New South Wales, working to support and strengthen community access to language collections. And I guess in this background, what I hope to bring today is a discussion that's both around the potency and the power of records and the ongoing complex issues that we as a profession face in relation to working with collections of trauma. I see the library and archive space as being a place where truth-telling can take place about our national histories, a place for us to reckon with our past in order to heal our futures. But in order for this to happen, we need the profession to get on board to build our understanding of Indigenous needs in this area. So today is a contribution to that conversation. In terms of placing myself, and before getting into an overview of what I'm discussing today, I also need to make some acknowledgements of people that I work with. In particular, I want to acknowledge the Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research and my colleagues, Lauren Booker, Cassie Willis, and more recently, Monica Galassi, who have contributed to the work in the Indigenous Archives and Data Stewardship team. My colleagues who work across the research hubs really are there to support Indigenous self-determination, and I'm constantly inspired by their work and their advocacy dedicated to responding to the empowerment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So Jumbunna is a research institute at UTS whose vision is to promote, support and embody the exercise and recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sovereignty and self-determination. And a key focus of the research is to respond to and empower the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And my colleagues aren't with me today, but I definitely want to acknowledge their contribution to this work. So a bit of an overview of the presentation. What I'll do is introduce the topic of Indigenous archives and record keeping and discuss its importance, which I've already highlighted. I'll discuss the development of the ASA module, give you an idea of the learning outcomes, the scope, and our collaborators to the project. And then I'm going to run through an overview of the key topic areas, which includes looking at the distinct requirements for Indigenous record keeping and archives, a focus on protocols for libraries and archives. I'll touch on key reports, recommendations, and projects relating to the area, and some mandates that we really should be looking at. And finally, the last topic of the module is looking at the importance of cultural competency and community consultation in regards to Indigenous record keeping. And finally, we'll finish up with a Q&A section, if I can work out GoToMeeting and looking at the screen. So over a year ago, the Jumbunna Research team began conversations with the Australian Society of Archivists about the potential to develop an introductory online course that related to the topic of Indigenous people and archives in Australia. The focus of learning was to be on the social and historical matters relating to Indigenous archives and archival practice, including the background on collections held in archives and collecting institutions, as well as other matters such as the relevance of protocols and community consultation for Indigenous record keeping. It was difficult to decide on the scope of the topic, especially given the diversity of Indigenous peoples, cultures and experiences, and thinking of how these experiences all relate to the broader field of archives and records. There's also a range of topics that relate to this area that intersect with other fields and areas of expertise. For example, whether in relation to collection documentation, digital preservation, curation, or the management of community archives. So where to start, and how do we honour and develop a module that is respectful to these many and varied needs? So we started out by engaging with a number of experts to get their insights into a number of topics and did research on what were the pieces of information that were required for people in the sector. We also know that anecdotally, many non-Indigenous people, including archivists, librarians and other information workers, get worried about the fact that they don't know where to start, or they want to help but they're afraid of getting things wrong. So we see this course as an introduction to develop your knowledge and understand some of the national priorities and how they relate to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples within the archives and records sectors. The focus throughout this course is to provide participants with a foundational understanding of the broad needs of Indigenous Australian people in regards to this space. And while the course has a focus on archives and records, it does include perspectives that are relevant to Indigenous priorities across the wider gallery, library, archive and museum sector. So I also, in that context, would like to acknowledge at the outset, there are many people working tirelessly across Australia in different community and organisational contexts to try and progress this work in GLAM. And I hope that these conversations are a small piece of progressing the work in the sector. I also want to point out the significant work that's been done by Terry Jenke and her collaborators as part of the Museums and Galleries Roadmap. I see this as an important piece that we should also be relying on. So why develop this course? I think it's important in the context of discussing Indigenous archives and record keeping that we acknowledge the gaps that we have in relation to education and professional development in the sector. It's unfortunate that many people have missed opportunities to extend their learning in this space, either through a failure of the school system or a lack of content that is included in archival studies. The Australian Society of Archivists have had a long commitment to supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests, and we know that people are working on improving these gaps. But one of the challenges of the lack of competency in this space is that we've got a lot of catch-up work to do to help people build their knowledge, skills and proficiencies in this area. We see this course as a foundation for people to get exposed to concepts and hear about projects and research that has taken place in order to build their own focus for action in their organisation or institutional settings. Since I've left working in an institutional context to focus on research and advocacy with communities, I've reflected and written more on these gaps. One of the tensions I see is a lack of our sector being able to adapt and respond to community needs in ways that are timely. I would argue that we have a lot of structural issues that we are yet to tackle, including racism, privilege, white privilege, colonial collecting paradigms that are yet fully considered in community contexts. And for me, education is a key part of us transforming our sector. So I'm now going to jump into the ASA module and spend the next part of the presentation talking to you about the topics that have informed our areas of focus. So here are the learning outcomes. Basically, by the end of the module, we would hope that people would have an idea of and would be able to describe the distinct requirements of Indigenous record keeping and archives. They'd be able to explain the ATSILON protocols for libraries, archives, and how they relate to practice. People should be able to list some of the key reports and recommendations that relate to Indigenous record keeping in Australia, and describe some of the key professional mandates for supporting Indigenous record keeping and archive priorities. We also hope that people could explain the role of cultural competency and community consultation in relation to building engagement and advocacy for these programs. So I want to introduce our experts and extend my personal thanks and the team's thanks to our experts who collaborated. We were fortunate to have a range of people who contributed with broad perspectives, who were able to respond and give their insights into the topics. So Dr. Jason DiSantolo from UTS, Ian Ham representing the Healing Foundation Stolen Generations Reference Group, Dr. Amanda Harris from Paradisec, Tasha James from the National Film and Sound Archive, Craig Longman from Jumbunna Research, Nathan Sentence from the Australian Museum, Narissa Timbry from the National Archives of Australia, and Damien Webb from the State Library of New South Wales. So the topics that we gave to our experts really were about what is good practice, what does good engagement look like, what is a good community partnership, and how do you support historic records access and members of the stolen generations to take care, or for archivists to take care of sensitive material. I've included some of the quotes from our experts throughout the presentation as we get into the topics, also to share their insights on the wider field. So the course provides introductory information to assist people working in archives and records, different archives and records contexts. Indigenous priorities, perspectives and worldviews often have distinct record keeping requirements, whether they be in relation to responding to complex historical archives and collections, or managing records through informed protocols. While practitioners must be responsible for their own journey around cultural competency and building their understanding of the requirements of communities in their local areas, there are some important background principles that lay the foundation of good practice with Indigenous priorities in the archive sector. This course will look at the background and context of collections relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are held in archives and collecting institutions, and will also discuss the relevance of protocols and consultation for Indigenous record keeping. So some of the important questions that were raised in this course is, what is the background and nature of major archival holdings relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples? Where are these records and collections held? Do these collections contain sensitive and/or culturally significant or sacred materials or information? What protocols and guidelines could assist with providing better access to records for community engagement? And what past reports or inquiries have been undertaken to advance understanding and support for Indigenous archive and record keeping? We hope that by exploring these questions and topics, the course will build participants' understanding of Indigenous record keeping requirements. We also hope that the course provides useful tips and suggestions on ways that the sector can develop ongoing engagement and partnerships with local communities to ensure effective dialogue and informed decision-making processes. So the key topics, I'm going to run you through the 5 that we're focused on. So the first was looking at the question of the distinct requirements of Indigenous record keeping, including introducing concepts around Indigenous archiving in a 65,000-year-old context, and introducing concepts of country and the living archive. We believe that you can't consider the topic of Indigenous archiving purely through a bureaucratic record view or through record structures, or by viewing records as only being situated in institutional contexts. We provide a background on Australian Indigenous record keeping and archiving, including areas such as the history of surveillance and study, as well as the broad context of government legislation affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including, importantly, the stolen generations. We've done this as we need to understand that our collecting practices are often informed by colonial collecting paradigms that continue to silence Indigenous people's voice, and our record keeping systems support power at the expense, some people's power at the expense of limiting the support for Indigenous people's agency and self-determination. We also cover the question of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protocols and their relationship with records. We privilege a view of records belonging to Indigenous people in terms of rights and management of information. So by introducing these general principles, we aim to illuminate some of the distinct requirements of Indigenous record keeping. We also recognise that each state, territory, and each community has had unique experiences, but against this backdrop of understanding, we encourage people to extend their learning on this topic in their local context or area. So here, Jason Disentola talks to us about the energy and spirit that's held in records, the experience of them being living archives, and how the processes of institutions returning materials to communities can really heal wounds. I think it's important in this first section of the module that we consider the terms and requirements of how we manage archives to respect these different elements of care. Ian Ham, in the context of records creation, also gets us to think about the current impact of the stolen generations and the importance of ongoing access to records for stolen generation survivors. Ian discusses how there are 17,000 people alive who are the stolen children, and that the impact of legislation, creation of missions, reserves, and children's home were all set up to dislocate, disperse, and remove Aboriginal people from their communities and families. So this context is important because it reminds us that these aren't just historic questions, but things that are incredibly relevant now. And Tasha James shares her thoughts on ISIP and considering how Indigenous cultural and intellectual property protocols work in the context of the National Film and Sound Archive. And Tash says, I guess for me, my understanding is anything that belongs to us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within our culture is considered as Indigenous cultural and intellectual property. So we set the scene with this background of Indigenous record keeping, and we move into the next topic on protocols for libraries, archives, and information services. We introduce the ATSI protocols for libraries and archives. We describe how the protocols have different areas of action that could be taken and applied in your local archive and information setting. And then we give people an opportunity to undertake activities and respond to questions that relate to specific protocols. We discuss each protocol in detail. For example, here on screen, that's Protocol 1 relates to questions on governance and management. It looks at the question of how important it is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are included in decision-making processes across archive, library, and record keeping landscapes. We give a section called What You Can Do, so action items around how to include Indigenous governance and management in decision-making processes. So we do this for all of the 12 protocols, giving people things to consider in their local context. Narissa Timbury within the module reminds us of the importance of protocols and talks about the relevance of her work now at the National Archives of Australia. But before this, talks about what it was like to start out in the profession without a guidebook on how to deal with complex and difficult information. So the protocols give advice and also help to start out dealing with materials that were offensive and derogatory. The next section of the module relates to key reports and recommendations and projects that have significance to Australian archiving and record keeping. While it wasn't intended to be an exhaustive list, we picked some of the key reports and recommendations that continue to have impact on our work today. We've covered the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the Bring Them Home report, introduced the National Apology, and also looked at the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. In learning about these key reports and recommendations, we want to bring greater visibility and insight for archival professionals in the archive sector to better understand the implications of past Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policies on people today. There was extensive research and engagement undertaken to formulate these reports and commissions, and many of their recommendations remain as unfinished business. We don't want to lose sight of these important recommendations. Engaging with archival projects and research that has already taken place can assist us in thinking about how you and your organisation may also respond to these key reports and recommendations. If we go back to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, we have work to do. If we go back to the recommendations of the Bringing Home report, we still have work to do. Ian Hamm again reminds us of the importance of the Bringing Them Home report and talks about the 54 recommendations in total. Many of those include relevance to the archive and record sector that need to be implemented, and that there are still many stories to be told. So we're very thankful to have Ian as part of the conversations. The second last topic area for the module relates to key professional mandates for supporting Indigenous record keeping and archive priorities. We suggest that the archive sector to move forward to implement international mandates such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there needs to be sector-specific engagement with rights and recommendations. So within this section, we explore key professional mandates such as the recently released International Council on Archives Tandanya Adelaide Declaration, which was released last year in 2019. We also go back to the important work that was done as part of the Australian Research Council project Trust and Technology in the mid-2000s that developed a statement of principles on Australian Indigenous knowledge in the archives, and an exposure draft position statement on human rights, Indigenous communities and the Australian archives. And we go back to the foundational work of this Australian Society of Archivists, who in 1996 released a policy statement on supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the profession. So these are examples of mandates and work that currently exist, and sometimes we see the need for people to reinvent the wheel. So simultaneously negotiating the requirements of wide-reaching Indigenous rights, mandates, and localised needs of communities can be daunting, particularly for individual practitioners. However, we believe if you work to align your archive and archival practice with these sector-specific mandates, you'll be able to strengthen your confidence in understanding what is current best practice and how you can assist the archive sector in working to support Indigenous priorities as a whole. Within this section of the module, we also had an opportunity to ask our experts about what they thought were some emerging issues related to the field. And I've shared here on screen the thoughts of Nathan Sentence, who talked about a key area being employment and the barriers for First Nations archivists, librarians, and that one of the things that we need to do is to figure out what the barriers are for people to join. So the final topic area that we've covered in the module relates to the role of cultural competency and community consultation in order to build engagement and advocacy for Indigenous record keeping programs. None of the areas of action can be developed, we believe, without some considerations about power, privileging, and building an understanding of how your own culture impacts the way that you engage with archives and records, and consequently, the kind of worldviews that are supported or not supported in mainstream programs. As part of the topic, we explore the role of cultural competency and community consultation in relation to building engagement, and we ask questions like, what is cultural competence and why is it important? We talk about principles of engagement and consultation around informed consent. And in order to give an example of these processes, we've discussed how people can manage processes regarding retrospective consent and digitisation of Indigenous materials. I guess there's a bit of a case study. And included in there are also some examples of partnerships and good practice. Put simply, we believe that being able to engage with and support Indigenous priorities requires archivists and record managers to be culturally competent. We recognise that many people working in the sector are at different stages of this journey. So we provide links to resources as part of this topic for people to find out more about cultural competency training and encourage discussions about how cultural competency can help support partnerships and the implementation of processes of informed consent, which are important to prioritise in the archive sector. Damien's words remind us of the deep biases in the profession and the importance of us considering questions of neutrality and for people to look at their own cultural perspective in terms of the work that they do. So what I've tried to do today is give an overview of the topic of Indigenous archives and record keeping. I've talked about the team who have contributed to the project. And again, I want to acknowledge the contributors and the writers who are part of this. I'm definitely just here as a spokesperson today. We're going to share information with you in a moment to find out when the course is coming online with the mailing list. And I guess today is really, for me, an opportunity to encourage people to get involved and to be part of the course. As was described in the presentation, there's a lot of unfinished business in the sector, and I believe we're all capable of contributing to making change. And I also want to point out, in terms of our contribution to this module, that it couldn't be everything. So we've really tried to make this foundational so that others can continue the education and the work that needs to be done to transform the sector. So I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to turn around and have a look at the questions, which is very bizarre while I'm here by myself. And I'm going to go to them now as I have a glass of water. But I'm going to put this up so you all have the link to information on the course. Okay, so James, I'm going to look at you for the chat and say, is everything right in terms of the technology? Yes, excellent. So I have a question here about how this course can be delivered to communities, particularly where Bring Them Home programs are being developed in community settings. And the process that can help people get access to collections. And I think, you know, this has been one of the challenges of developing an introductory sort of foundational course, is that we couldn't cover everything. I think that there's more need to develop community specific training that works on how do you work with the bring them home recommendations, and this course might be there to get people thinking, but it is definitely directed at archives and records managers in getting started. So I guess in response to that question, who's come from Kath, thanks for asking, and I think this is, to me, something that we can take up as a profession and look at the other pieces of work that need to happen. Okay. Got a really interesting question here from Lindsay Walker. Thanks, Lindsay. Asking about, those boundaries around materials that aren't paper-based and that perhaps might be in some ways collected through different practices, particularly in museum settings. Are they considered to be archival records? I think the thing that I would say in response to that is that, to me, the archival domain and some of the concepts that we talk about in the module around living archives and the research that has been done really looks at the knowledge that is connected to those objects. So I think there's important work that museum curators can do to support the curation of that content, but it would be interesting to find out more about the context. And I've got your details here, so I can follow up with that as well. From Nicola, a question about who I would hope would take the course. Look, I think for people that have come into the profession, and again in that context of you've got significant collections but you don't know where to start, the Acylone protocols were developed in 1995 and they're a great place to start. They do need reviewing because it's been a long time since they were developed. However, I think there's a bit of a baseline there for people who have responsibility for opening up collections, and not just Indigenous programming or collection management. I think, I would hope that senior managers across all of the collecting institutions would have this foundational knowledge, because as I mentioned in the presentation, it wasn't always something that has been covered both in our education system or in library and archive training. I did my archival studies in the late 90s and in the 2000s, and we certainly have a long way to go in really getting that curriculum in there. So yeah, I would hope that people would either take this course because they needed to build that knowledge, or it's also a refresher. I mean, for myself, working in roles that have been about the Bring Them Home report, I like to go back and read that because so much of those recommendations are still so critical that we don't lose sight of what they mentioned. Okay. So a message from Juliet Bill. Thank you, Juliet. A question about traditional knowledge labels and licenses. The course doesn't go into specifics of systems or tools that are out there, but at a high level would get people thinking about what are ICIP considerations and what do people need to think about in terms of managing material. Again, I think there are other projects that can talk more specifically about those approaches, but at a high level, we want people to be questioning ownership and who has rights to manage material in ongoing ways. Another question here from Jean, and if I don't get through them all, because I know we're winding up to the end, about whether I think the Acylone protocols are useful and relevant in Aboriginal community control archives, or are there other principles and protocols that are more relevant in those contexts? I think the Acylone protocols, they open up dialogue about complexity. So even in Aboriginal community controlled organisations, if you have material that has been collected in ways that may have not been through informed consent, then I think the protocols are relevant there. But to me, community protocols are actually the work that needs to be written. So, you know, I think it'd be wonderful if the Aboriginal community controlled organisations could make their own protocols. A question from the president, Julia Mant. The course is great for professional development training, but do you think there's one thing archivists can start doing now that will make a difference? And I'm probably, if everyone else thinks I should finish up with this one, and I'll answer the rest. James has said that he's keeping the details so I can follow up by email. It's a difficult question, Julia. I think reflecting on Sorry Day yesterday, looking at the continued rates of Indigenous imprisonment, the continued rates of child removal, is that I don't think our profession should just look at what we need to do about historic records access. We have a whole lot of expertise around record keeping and we've got lessons to learn from our past practices to really start to inform a new agenda that ensures that Aboriginal people's rights are protected into the future. So I would encourage people to read and get involved, read books, talk to local community members, but start to think about the ways that you prioritize this work. As we've all heard that mantra, we need to make this work everybody's business. This isn't something any longer that I think we can have as a special interest. This is really about reconciliation, truth telling, and I think it's important that everyone gets involved. So James, I'm looking at your chat. It's the final thing. Thank you all for joining me. This has been a weird experience being in Marrickville by myself, presenting in my study. I'm happy to ask questions outside of here. And yeah, thank you all for joining me, and I hope you can share information on the course, and thanks to the ASA for hosting this today and for doing the module. So I'll say goodbye. Thank you.